In this way, man was no longer insecure about his destination in the afterlife, but rather, he was insecure about his sense of self, which he could only enhance through ceaseless work. But indeed, defining ourselves by that which is external, that is work, seems terribly wrong. Thus, after the Industrial Revolution, man entered a therapeutic age in which he sought to rectify this selfish monster that had been created through this accumulation obsession where paradoxically, the self had been lost. Above we referenced Lash to exclaim that the inner-directed Anglo-Saxon is characteristically driven by intellect and not instinct. Indeed, a successful repression of instinct was necessary to lead the ascetic lifestyle conducive to a capitalistic society. During the therapeutic age, many sought to argue that man's growing intellect did not eliminate his instincts, but rather clouded or oppressed them. Characteristic of the now modern secular man, this phenomenon was explained in empirical terms. Fromm understands instinctual development as the growth of self, and intellectual development as the growth of intellect manifested in individuation. Thus he states, quote, "While the process of individuation takes place automatically, the growth of the self is hampered for a number of individual and social reasons. The lag between these two trends results in an unbearable feeling of isolation and powerlessness." End quote. Indeed, it was these hopeless feelings characteristic of the Industrial Revolution that this therapeutic age of the 20th century sought to rectify. One could argue that the Protestant reformer had a more instinctual trust in God that was eliminated during the mid-19th century through the growth of empiricism. Fromm attributes man's insecurity to this loss or oppression of instinct. Quote, "He-man is the most helpless of all animals at birth. His adaptation to nature is based essentially on the process of learning, not on instinctual determination." Instinct is a diminishing, if not a disappearing category in higher animal forms, especially in the human. End quote. Thus, in the therapeutic age man begins to rationally describe the value of instinct, or intuition. It is paradoxically through his rational intellectual character, which freed him from his original ties thus making him insecure, that he understands his desire to submit back to his powerful instincts. In a Darwinian sense, modern man sought security not from God's salvation, but rather saw his salvation in having a defining existential role as a meaningful biological species possessing instincts and existing taxonomically in a scientific world. As a member of the animal kingdom, modern man seems to envy the apparent lack of psychological insecurity observed in lesser animals who are guided instinctually, not intellectually. Author Kurt Vonnegut makes this envy explicit, quote, "Tiger got to hunt, bird got to fly, man got to sit and wonder why. Tiger got to sleep, bird got to land, man got to tell himself he understand." End quote. In this sense, we get the feeling that modern man is plagued by his overaccumulation of rationality, so to speak, for it has clouded his biological role in the world. Knowing he is driven by instincts, but ultimately unable to identify them, man's existence appears meaningless in modernity. Modern man thus seeks his salvation in a more existential sense. Thus, the malaise of insecurity was attributed to a neglect of the instincts in the modern age. From all angles of modern life, this lack of intuition, soul, gratification, instinct, libido, and various other terms meaning the same thing was identified. Musician Igor Stravinsky, noticing this lack of meaning in modern music, similarly attributed this problem to repression of instinct resulting from an anomic society. Quote, "To have recourse to history in this case, even to prehistory, is that not to overshoot our mark by seeking to grasp what cannot be grasped? How shall we reasonably explain what no one has ever witnessed? If we take reason alone as a guide in this field, it will lead us straight to falsehoods, since it will no longer be enlightened by instinct. Instinct is infallible. If it leads us astray, it is no longer instinct." End quote. Grasping what cannot be grasped is characteristic of an anomic capitalistic society, where an accumulative asceticism grows so large that it clouds out human instinct altogether. One could speculate that the ascetic lifestyle, originally adopted to achieve salvation in the afterlife, made man repress his desire to focus on this life. since the insecurity driving capitalism in modernity became manifest as a repression of instinct, not as delayed gratification to please God, it is necessary to examine the instincts. Society, perceived by the social Darwinists as rationally explicable in evolutionary terms, now appears irrational, conflicted, and full of contradictions. Indeed, Herbert Marcuse identifies the chaotic, irrational state of modernity, quote, "What people mean when they say is related to what they don't say. Or, what they mean cannot be taken at face value, not because they lie, but because the universe of thought and practice in which they live is a universe of manipulated contradictions." End quote. Here we see a society diagnosed as chaotic and contradictory, and thus it is no surprise society is plagued by neurotic insecurity. Again, the ambiguity of a destination in the afterlife, perceived in the past, is seen as the ambiguity of a destination in the present. Just as the Protestants sought to ease this insecurity by indulging God, some modern men have sought to settle this ambiguity by hailing its paradoxical honesty, thus indulging rationalism. Ralph Waldo Emerson praises the ambiguity of a conflicted society explicitly, quote, "Suppose you should contradict yourself, what then? Trust your emotion. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency a great soul has simply nothing to do." End quote. Paradoxically, using a rational argument, Emerson feels that rationalism results in boredom, makes life meaningless, and thus leaves society existentially insecure. The therapeutic age seeks to assuage the insecurity of modernity with a similarly ironic rational approach to the understanding of irrational instinct. The thinkers of the therapeutic age have understood people to be as individually conflicted as society appears to be. Perhaps the individual's interaction with society, or rather, his need to accumulate the external, has caused the integration of external ideas into his self, manifested as his superego. Freud elaborates on this internalization, quote, "A great change takes place only when the authority is internalized through the establishment of a superego. The superego torments the sinful ego with the same feeling of anxiety, and is on the watch of opportunities of getting it punished by the external world." End quote. The insecurity of modern man is seen here as a natural psychological interaction of internalized instinctual phenomena. Thus, it is the superego that instructs the individual how to behave, not God. Indeed, through a sublimation of instinct, the superego tames the instincts, or rather oppresses them to help an individual interact with an external world that he has accumulated and internalized. Freud sees this sublimation as characteristic of modernity, progress, and thus we can speculate capitalism as well. Quote, "Sublimation of instinct is what makes it possible for higher psychical activities, scientific,